After my husband went into hiding, these people, they broke into the house, they ransacked the house, they beat me, and including these marks. After that, I had to wake up and I had to leave the country.
When Noreen fled Zimbabwe, she had to leave her children behind. They didn't know whether she was alive or dead. Eventually, Noreen arrived in New York, where she didn't know anyone.
This is when I met a total stranger, a woman. She gave me a card and said, approach the Advocates for Human Rights and they can help you. That's how I got to know about the Advocates for Human Rights.
For 30 years, the Advocates for Human Rights has shined a light on human rights violations in Minnesota, the United States, and around the world. Through the dedication of volunteers and the support of its community, the Advocates has helped thousands of individuals like Noreen find safety from violence and persecution. The Advocates for Human Rights began in 1983 in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I had just become mayor of Minneapolis. Sam Hines had this idea that perhaps there ought to be a committee on human rights.
The first project arose from the aftermath of the killing of Benigno Aquino, who'd been assassinated walking down the gangway from an airplane as he returned to the Philippines. That was the beginnings of a number of things, in particular the Minnesota Protocol, which is now internationally accepted as protocol in such instances. But it also began the process of assembling other then young lawyers to do work on international human rights law.
The Advocates for Human Rights was started as an organization that understood that we all have a part in improving human rights around the world and making them real. That has continued from the beginning.
You know, there is a tradition here in Minnesota of social justice. I want to respond to the question my father always had at the end of any debate that we ever had about politics and social justice issues, and that was, well, what are you going to do about it? What action are you going to take? That's what the Advocates are all about.
In 1993, the Advocates established one of the first programs in the world to focus exclusively on women's human rights.
I got involved in trafficking when I was 19 years old. I was able to get out in less than a year, but that is the rare side of this. Many women never get out. We need laws to change if we really want to save women and children that are used this way. Where the Advocates come in for breaking free is there are voices there.
In 2010 and 2011, the Advocates led a coalition of partners to formulate and pass the Safe Harbor Law in Minnesota, a law that improves protection for victims of trafficking. The Advocates has brought its legal expertise on ending violence against women to countries around the world. Every year, the Advocates coordinates the work of volunteers to provide free legal representation in over 500 cases, helping victims of human rights violations. Ifrah Jamale was born in Somalia and, with the help of the Advocates, obtained asylum in the United States.
With the Advocates' help, I went from jail and in fear of deportation to being a permanent resident of the U.S., a college graduate, and a columnist of Ask a Somali for Twin Cities Daily Planet. My life could have taken to so many different paths. Because of you, I'm here today.
The Advocates works with diaspora groups for justice and human rights in many countries. The Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to investigate human rights violations that occurred in the country between 1979 and 2003. Jim O'Neill is an attorney who volunteered with the project.
It was known to the Liberians in their own country and in the diaspora that this investigation had gone forward, that the perpetrators of human rights abuses had been identified, and that a historical record was made which would not be forgotten.
Coming from a country where you're dodging bullets, you're trying to flee for your life and all of that. So being a part of the process that will restore peace and democracy and rule of law is very satisfying.
Since 1992, The Advocates has worked with educators to teach thousands of students in K-12 schools and colleges about international human rights. Sherry Kemp is a teacher in the St. Paul, Minnesota School District.
They can see themselves as part of humanity versus one person who is completely different from every other person in the world.
In the United States, The Advocates uses human rights education and advocacy to build welcoming communities.
We got involved with the Advocates of Human Rights since 2003. We were working at that time on immigration. There were people on the streets, they were stopped by racial profiling, so we start working on preventing that. It has been very useful in Minnesota, very helpful for the immigrants.
Halfway across the world, The Advocates provides a free education to more than 300 students in Nepal. Founded in 1999, the Songkhu Palabari Community School provides children with outstanding teachers, textbooks, school materials, a nutritious daily meal, and an alternative to child labor.
A couple years ago, I went and visited the Nepal school. The kindergartners were reading English, their second language, nearly fluently. It was incredible. These kids in Nepal were receiving an education that was equal to or greater than my education here in the U.S.
Since the 1980s, The Advocates has also used education and international human rights standards to oppose the use of the death penalty in the United States and around the world. Throughout The Advocates' history, volunteers and supporters have been the backbone of the organization's success.
I've always been proud of being a lawyer, but I've never been more proud of that than through the work I've done with the Advocates for Human Rights.
It is important for us to be involved with the Advocates of Human Rights because it's a way for us to protect the human rights of the people in our communities.
Working with the advocates, whether you're donating money or you're giving pro bono time, I think you're really making a concrete impact on the lives of real people.
The Advocates helped Noreen find shelter and, eventually, obtain asylum in the United States. She now cleans houses for a living and volunteers with nonprofit organizations. She was also able to reunite with her children. Since 1983, The Advocates for Human Rights has worked toward a world in which every person lives with dignity, freedom, justice, equality, and peace.
To get involved with human rights gives one a better sense of not only to appreciate what we have, but also to understand who we are as a people, who we are as a society, and with that insight one becomes a better citizen, a more informed citizen, and more engaged citizen.
This is an organization where your work actually changes the lives of other people in our community and in the world.
It's something that is so sacred and so special that each of us has a stake and need to love and preserve it and nurture it. That's what the Advocates stand for, human rights for everyone.
I think human rights describes the way in which people must relate to one another within the community, within the society, within the world.
I'd like us to stand up and speak with a megaphone, because I think that what goes on here in Minnesota is something that needs to be replicated in communities across the country and in communities around the world.
It's a window on the world and a way to engage that's unique.
With your support, together we can end violence against women, save the lives of people fleeing persecution, restore peace in countries affected by conflict, and educate people about the power of human rights to create more just and peaceful world. Join us in working for dignity and justice for the next 30 years.